There's a particular kind of person who doesn't notice they're exhausted until they're suddenly, completely out of gas. Not tired in the normal sense, where the day gradually winds down and the body asks for rest in small, reasonable increments. More like, fine, 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 fine. And then, without warning, not fine at all. A wall, arriving with no runway. The same pattern often shows up with hunger. Some people forget to eat for hours, not because they're disciplined, not because they're fasting, but because the signal that's supposed to say, you need food, simply never arrived. And then, somewhere around hour 7, it doesn't arrive gently either. It arrives as irritability, shakiness, a sudden inability to think clearly, a mood that seems to come from nowhere until someone finally asks, "Wait, when did you last eat?" If this sounds familiar, you've probably been told some version of, "You need to listen to your body." Which is true, but also strange advice for a body that isn't sending the messages it's supposed to send in the first place. This isn't a willpower problem, and it isn't a discipline problem. It's a signal processing problem. And understanding it starts with a part of the nervous system most people have never heard of. Doing a job that, under enough pressure, quietly stops doing it well. The sense responsible for noticing hunger, fatigue, a racing heart, or a tight chest has a name: interoception. It's the sensory channel that monitors the internal state of the body. Read here, hunger; here, low energy; here, elevated heart rate. The same way, vision monitors the external world. Most people never think about it. For the same reason, most people never think about their eyesight when it's working normally. It only becomes visible to consciousness when it isn't doing its job. For decades, interoception was treated like a passive gauge, a one-directional flow of information moving from the body up to the brain, where the brain would simply read the dial. But more recent neuroscience, including the predictive coding work led by Lisa Feldman Barrett, has revised this picture substantially. The body doesn't just send raw signals upward and wait for the brain to notice. The brain is constantly generating predictions about what the body's internal state should be. And what reaches conscious awareness isn't the raw signal itself, but the brain's best guess, adjusted only when the actual signal strongly contradicts the prediction. This matters enormously because it means interoception isn't simply a measurement system. It's a forecasting system. And forecasts can be wrong in a specific, consistent direction, especially under conditions of chronic stress. Here's where the mechanism gets interesting. The brain doesn't just track bodily signals for their own sake. According to what's called allostasis, essentially the body's predictive energy budget, the brain's core job is to anticipate the body's future needs and mobilize resources before a crisis hits, rather than simply reacting after the fact. Hunger, fatigue, and other interoceptive signals are part of that budgeting system. They exist to tell the brain when the account is running low so it can act in time. Under chronic stress, this budgeting system gets reorganized. The nervous system, occupied with managing a near-constant low-grade threat response, begins prioritizing certain signals over others. Specifically, threat-related processing tends to dominate the brain's interoceptive attention, while signals related to ordinary maintenance, hunger, fatigue, the need for rest, get pushed down the priority list. Not erased, deprioritized. The body is still generating the signal. The brain is simply spending its predictive bandwidth elsewhere, on a system it has been trained by repeated stress exposure to treat as more urgent. This is consistent with what researchers describe as a maladaptive interoceptive style, a pattern. distinct from simply lacking awareness, in which bodily signals are chronically avoided, suppressed, or overridden, often without conscious intention, frequently accompanied by distraction or difficulty tolerating discomfort once it does surface. Crucially, this isn't a fixed trait some people are simply born with. It's a pattern that gets reinforced through repetition. Every time a hunger signal is overridden because there's a deadline, every time fatigue is pushed through because stopping isn't an option, the brain updates its prediction model a little further in the direction of, these signals are not the priority right now. Over time, the prediction model stops asking. This is the part that explains the specific shape of the crash. Someone with a well-calibrated interoceptive system gets a gradually increasing signal: mild hunger, moderate hunger, time to eat. Someone whose system has been retrained under chronic stress doesn't get that gradual ramp. The early-stage low-intensity version of the signal gets filtered out by a prediction model that has learned not to flag it. What does eventually break through is the late-stage version, the point where the body's actual deficit is now severe enough that no prediction model, however biased, can suppress it any longer. There is no gentle warning, there's only silence and then a wall. This also explains why the crash so often arrives wearing the disguise of an emotional problem rather than a physical one. Irritability that seems to come from nowhere. A sudden wave of anxiety with no clear trigger. A feeling of being abruptly, inexplicably overwhelmed. These often get interpreted by the person experiencing them, and sometimes by people around them, as character or mood, when they are functioning here as the delayed, amplified arrival of a basic physiological signal that should have surfaced hours earlier in a much milder form. There's a specific population where this pattern shows up with particular consistency: people in sustained, high-demand environments, caregivers, people in high-stress careers, anyone managing prolonged uncertainty or threat. Research on interoception and chronic stress has documented altered stress hormone patterns, including disrupted cortisol rhythms, in exactly these populations: caregivers managing ongoing family stress, people exposed to sustained workplace pressure, individuals carrying unresolved trauma. The nervous system in each case has adapted to a world that required constant outward vigilance, and the cost of that adaptation is partly paid in reduced access to its own internal state. There is importantly evidence that this isn't a permanent setting. Studies using structured interoceptive training, simple practices like guided attention to heartbeat or breath, have found measurable improvements in interoceptive accuracy after only a handful of sessions, along with gains in emotional awareness and the ability to tolerate, rather than immediately distract from, internal discomfort. The prediction model that learned to deprioritize these signals can, with enough consistent counter-evidence, learn something different. But the relearning has to happen gradually, the same way the original suppression did. One signal noticed, one signal trusted, repeated enough times that the brain updates its forecast. So when someone insists they're fine, right up until the moment they very clearly are not, that gap isn't dishonesty, and it isn't a lack of self-awareness in the way that phrase usually gets used. It's a forecasting system that has been trained under real and often prolonged pressure to filter out exactly the kind of early signal that would have prevented the crash. The information was there. It just wasn't being passed along. There's something worth sitting with in the idea that a body can be telling you something for hours before you ever hear it. Not because you weren't listening hard enough, but because somewhere along the way, The part of you responsible for translating the message learned that the message wasn't safe to deliver yet. The wall isn't where the problem started. It's just the first place the signal was finally loud enough to get through.